It is the 19th of June, 451, and a comet blazes across a crepuscular sky. In those days, the comet had no name, at least none that was recorded, but the cause of its appearance, that much might be divined. When Attila the Hun consulted the soothsayers, their grim forebodings must have come as a rude surprise. Was he not, after all, Attila, the scourge of God himself? Was he not standing here on the fields of Maurica, undefeated, at the head of a mighty coalition of Huns, Franks, Goths, Burgundians, and others? Were the Romans formed against him, not smitten with terror already, and had they not gone almost a quarter century without facing a Hun in battle? Surely then, for this force of nature, born to shake nations and terrorize the world, the comet could only portend victory. But unfortunately for Attila, the Romans had also assembled a mighty coalition, and they too counted Franks, Goths, and Burgundians among its members. That very day, a skirmish broke out between Attila's Gepids and the Franks aligned with the Roman general Aetius. It was the Franks, we are told, that emerged victorious, but not before losing as many men as had been killed among the Gepids. The next day brought the main engagement. Two great unions of discordant races come to Mongu to decide the fate of the West. In the words of Jordanes, the battlefield was a sloping plain rising sharply on one side to a hill, and which both armies were wanting to obtain. The Huns with their forces occupied the right half, the Romans with their allies the left, and so began the contest about the unoccupied crest. The contest began with the trotting advance of the cavalry, each lance bare of pennon and tucked under an armpit. Behind the horsemen and on either side of them were the foot soldiers, jogging to a distance of one bowshot from the enemy and hurling their javelins to begin the melee. Yet before a king of the hill could be crowned, a stalemate swept across the ranks, and it was during this lull in the fighting that Attila supposedly addressed his men. "Here you stand," he told them, "after conquering mighty nations and subduing the world. Then on to the fray with stout hearts as is your wont. No spear shall harm those who are sure to live, and those who are sure to die, fate overtakes even in peace. I shall hurl the first spear at the foe. If any can stand at rest while Attila fights, he is a dead man." In spite of these words, the renewed melee became more and more confused, and slowly but surely Attila's army began to look the worse for wear. At the chaotic center of the ridge, Goths, Alans, and Huns vied for supremacy. Eventually, the Alans punctured the Hunnic line, collapsing the center and sending Attila's army into a well-ordered retreat. As the Huns withdrew to their camp, their foes pursued them at a measured pace, wisely avoiding the perils that a feigned retreat could pose. Of Attila, it was said that he fought like a lion pierced by hunting spears, who paces to and fro before the mouth of his den, but dares not spring. As the Huns finally reached their camp, they constructed a wagon fort, something the Romans would see again when they fought the Pechenegs and Khazars centuries later. In this confrontation, the oppressive darkness, combined with the approach of Attila's Goths, precluded a decisive assault. After daylight pierced the outer dark, it was said that the king remained supremely brave even in this extremity, and had heaped up a funeral pyre of horse trappings, so that if the enemy should attack him, he could cast himself into the flames, that none might have the joy of wounding him, and that the lord of so many races might not fall into the hands of his foes. But as fate would have it, such a precaution proved unnecessary. The Roman general Aetius had no interest in making the victory complete. He did not trust his allies any more than they trusted him, and he may have hoped to win the Huns back to his side as mercenaries. The general had no way of knowing that in only 2 years' time, the terror of the world Attila would expire of a nosebleed. Nor could he know that for all his efforts, Roman Gaul would be carved up like a cake between the Franks, the Visigoths, and the protagonists of our story, the Burgundians. Compared to their barbaric counterparts, the Burgundians are a lesser-known fixture of late antiquity. Even so, their story is no less interesting, nor their divinations any less worthy of our attention. We do not know what Burgundian soothsayers made of the Mauriac comet, but rest assured that their descendants would see this comet again, and again, and again. During the millennium of blood and wine to follow, this very comet appeared on no fewer than 14 separate occasions. Each time it did, the world looked just a little bit more like our own, in no small part thanks to the Burgundians. Have you ever dreamed of forging a late antique kingdom yourself? Well, with Forge of Empires, you can do just that. In fact, this game lets you go even further. You can start all the way back in the Stone Age and keep expanding your kingdom till it's a galactic empire. Doing so will require carefully managing your tech tree, economy, and military. Take opponents on in PvP scenarios and conquer the continents through turn-based tactics. Just don't forget to ask for some help. Join or create a guild to play with your friends, trade wares, and fight together to keep expanding your kingdom. Forge of Empires has over 130 million downloads and is available on iOS, Android, and PC. It even has a browser version. Download the game today by scanning the QR code or clicking the link below. Once you complete the tutorial, you'll get 25 Forge points, 1,000 coins, and 1,000 supplies right away, plus 150 raffle tickets and 2 golden dice throws by reaching the Bronze Age with the welcome event. A big thanks to Forge of Empires for supporting history content on YouTube, and with that said, let's get back to the Burgundians. The Burgundian story began at least 44 years before the Battle of the Mauriacian Fields. It began when the Rhine River froze in the watershed winter of 406. In came pouring Vandals, Suebi, Alans, and most importantly for our purposes, 80,000 Burgundians under the famous King Gunther. Though the question of their provenance is debated to this day, it has traditionally been thought that the Burgundians came from Bornholm, an island on the Baltic Sea. In Old Norwegian, the island was called Burgundarholmer, which is how the Burgundians got their name. They left their homeland at a time when many others were leaving theirs. It may have been the waning temperatures, the expansion of the Huns, or another case of Iliadic hubris. Soon the Burgundians found themselves in the area around Worms, and in no time at all, their kingdom received imperial recognition in exchange for protecting the limes. This, however, was not enough for the Burgundian Aeneas Gunther, and in 411 he conspired with the king of the Alans to put the Gallo-Roman Jovinus in power. With this cipher's imperial backing, Gunther claimed the west bank of the Rhine and turned the city of Borbeto Magus into his capital. It was only in 435 that Gunther overstepped. His attempt to expand into Gallia Belgica was stymied by none other than Aetius, who on this occasion was joined by Attila the Hun. In the aftermath, as many as 20,000 Burgundians lay dead, among them Gunther and most of his kin. One of the few to survive was his son Gundioch, who led his people to Sapaudia with imperial authorization. The many retellings of those events eventually coalesced into the Nibelungenlied, basically the German Iliad. But while the Burgundians were busy telling stories and rebuilding, Attila the Hun smelled blood in the water. In 447, he set to pillaging the region he had only recently defended on behalf of the empire. 4 years later, Attila was, as we know, defeated at the Battle of the Mauriacian Fields, allowing the Franks, Visigoths, and Burgundians to put down roots in Gaul. The next few years brought conflicts with the Gepids and inevitably with the Romans. Under the leadership of Mauriacian, the empire briefly succeeded in retaking Lugdunum from the Burgundians. By 461, the barbarian leader Ricimer had Mauriacian beheaded, becoming the real power behind the Western throne until 472. The Burgundians, meanwhile, were still ruled by Gundioch, who had married Ricimer's sister and had a child by her called Gundobad. On his uncle Ricimer's orders, Gundobad beheaded the Western emperor Anthemius before becoming a Roman patrician and putting a new cipher in power. 4 more years of this song and dance would follow before the Western Roman Empire was no more. In Gaul, the climactic moment came 10 years after that, when Clovis, the king of the Franks, extinguished the last Roman holdout in Soissons. Though the Western Roman Empire was gone, the Romans most certainly were not. In Constantinople, the light of their civilization still burned bright, and here in Gaul its glow was felt on everything from the dress, to the food, to the language, to the people themselves. On the paved streets of Lugdunum, Burgundians and Gallo-Romans walked side by side, sometimes, it must be noted, with more than a hint of resentment. As far back as 466, Sidonius Apollinaris described the Burgundians as long-haired giants more than 6 feet in height who speak an incomprehensible babble. They smear their hair with rancid butter, and their food stinks of an excess of onions and garlic. In all likelihood, the description reveals less about the Burgundians and more about the prejudices of the Gallo-Roman people. 4 centuries ago, they had been the subject of similar cliches, and now it was simply the Burgundians' turn to become civilized. As was the case with the Franks and Visigoths, the process of Romanization continued even after the breakdown of imperial authority, the best example being the promulgation of Roman law. Under Gundobad, the Lex Burgundionum was compiled in the late 6th century, around the same time as the Frankish Lex Salica, and well before the Lex Visigothorum. Though the Burgundian Code combined Roman law with Germanic customs, it was recorded in Latin and designed to appease the not-so-silent Gallo-Roman majority. Both peoples now enjoyed legal representation and the right to intermarry, but all were subject to Germanic customs around inheritance and retribution. Compared to the Gallo-Romans, the Burgundians favored a strict hereditary succession and harsh consequences for animal theft. In a word, they cared a great deal about their kids and pets. If you stole someone's dog, you were legally obligated to kiss the animal's behind in front of a bunch of people. If you stole someone's falcon, your head and chest would be covered with meat, and the falcon would get to peck it off of you. Though these consequences must have baffled the Gallo-Romans, they would have made sense to those inducted into an honor and shame-based culture. It is also worth noting that you could avoid such consequences altogether by paying the commensurate fine. 1 solitus for killing a dog, 12 solidi for shaving a woman's hair off, 30 for murdering a slave, 40 for murdering a carpenter, 50 for a blacksmith, 100 for a silversmith, and 200 for a goldsmith. The code also clarified that anyone caught sneaking around a vineyard at night or during the harvest period could be killed without repercussions. Judging from this and the proximity of the world-famous Golden Slopes, it's safe to say the Burgundians quickly developed a taste for wine. In this respect at least, they had something in common with their Gallo-Roman counterparts. Over time, these two peoples learned to share their wines, their courts, their names, and even their languages. But there was always one Germanic word that stuck out like a sore thumb: Faihitha, roughly translating to vendetta. This was the dark side of the honor and shame-based culture of the Burgundian people. It meant that in spite of Gundobad's law code, his society was not above the occasional extrajudicial murder. Nor did King Gundobad provide the best example. According to Gregory of Tours, the father of French history, Gundobad killed his brother Chilperic with the sword and sank his wife in water with a stone tied to her neck. His 2 daughters he condemned to exile. The older of these, who became a nun, was called Crona, and the younger, Clotilda. Not long after that, Clotilda married Clovis, the neighboring king of the Franks, and whether or not she had Gundobad's blessing, the marriage would, in time, spell their family's ruin. For now, though, Gundobad had many reasons to pursue a Frankish alliance. After Theodoric split his rival Odoacer from thigh to collarbone, Gundobad was wedged between the Franks and Visigoths on one side, and now the Ostrogoths on the other. He also had 3 brothers to contend with at home. These were Chilperic, Godamar, and Godagel. I have already mentioned the fate of Chilperic, which Godamar seems to have shared, but the last brother, Godagel, proved more slippery than the others. Per Gregory of Tours, Godagel made entreaties to the king of the Franks, telling him that, "If you will give me aid in attacking my brother, so that I may be able to kill him in battle or drive him from the country, I will pay you every year whatever tribute you yourself wish to impose." Around the year 500, Clovis took Godagel up on his offer and marched an army eastward to Burgundy. Believing the Franks to be acting unilaterally, Gundobad erred critically by declaring a ceasefire with his brother and marching alongside him to Dijon. When these 3 armies met along the river Ouche, Clovis and Godagel turned on Gundobad and sent him into retreat. Before long, Gundobad found himself besieged by Clovis's forces in Avignon, and for all intents and purposes, it looked like his days were numbered. But fortunately for him, he had the crafty advisor Aetius by his side, a Gallo-Roman judging from his name. Famed for his energy and wisdom, Aetius pretended to defect to the Franks and persuaded Clovis to abandon the siege. Gundobad was allowed to continue ruling part of the Burgundian kingdom, with the only condition being that he pay an annual tribute to the Franks. Within a year, Gundobad reneged on his pledge and besieged Godagel in Vienne, repaying his brother's treachery in kind. To stave off starvation, Godagel expelled much of the city's population, among these the artisan who maintained the Roman-era aqueduct. In retaliation, the artisan led a detachment of Gundobad's army through the aqueduct, with iron crowbars being used to remove the stone covering the vent. Inside, all hell broke loose. A trumpet sounded, the walls were taken, and the gates thrown open to let the rest of the army in. Despairing of escape, Godagel took refuge in an Arian church, and it was there that he was slain alongside the heretical bishop. In passing, it is mentioned that several Burgundian senators were also slain, confirming the moribund existence of another vestige of Roman civilization. Unlike the senators, the captive Franks were all merely exiled. It is believed by some, Gregory of Tours included, that Gundobad secretly converted to the doctrine of the Trinity. Publicly, he pursued a policy of religious toleration, though he himself remained an Arian. This meant he was part of the Christian strain that held the Father as distinct from the Son, an interpretation favored by the Goths, the Vandals, and later the Lombards. In 508, his neighbor Clovis made history by being baptized in the Nicene faith, thereby fulfilling a battlefield pledge made 12 years earlier. Previously, Clovis had not been a misguided heretic, but an unwashed pagan, making his choice to convert to the Nicene Creed as shocking as it was consequential. The decision was largely motivated by his Burgundian bride Clotilda, who was, unusually for her time and place, raised to worship the Trinity. As the centuries progressed, the Nicene Creed became the basis of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, both of which consider Arianism an outmoded heresy. Clotilda's effort to convert the king eventually earned her a sainthood, a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that France became Catholic because of a Burgundian queen. Nor is that all her people did to cement the rise of Catholicism. 2 years before Clovis's baptism, Gundobad's son Sigismund converted from the Arian to the Nicene Creed. This effectively made him the first Germanic leader inducted into the Catholic Church. 10 years later, Sigismund succeeded his father to the Burgundian throne. Until then, he had kept busy administering his late uncle's lands, and joining the Franks' campaigns against the Visigoths. He'd also founded a monastery dedicated to Saint Maurice, built on the very site where this Egyptian legionary was martyred. Sigismund had much to be grateful for. His eastern flank was secured through his marriage to Ostrogatha, the daughter of Theodoric the Great. As a show of goodwill, the king of the Ostrogoths sent the Burgundians a water and sun clock, as well as several technicians. He also provided his son-in-law with safe passage on his pilgrimage to Rome. Meanwhile, in the west, the Visigoths had been neutralized ever since the Battle of Fouillé. Due to Sigismund's cooperation, the victorious Franks were now on good terms with him as well. Only one among the Franks had an axe to grind with this new king, a Burgundian cousin of his, fired up by the spirit of Faihitha. For now, this cousin patiently bade her time. 7 years hence, her moment would come, but not before another feud shook her house to its very foundations. This particular vendetta embroiled not two brothers, but a father and a son. Following the death of Ostrogatha, with whom Sigismund had a son named Sigric, he married a comely attendant of hers who wasted no time at all getting herself into trouble. She immediately began spreading foul rumors about her stepson, and during a day of ceremony appeared before all the kingdom in her predecessor's dress. Sigric confronted her then and there, saying, "You are not worthy to have on your back those garments which are known to have belonged to your mistress, that is, my mother." In her rage, this femme fatale turned the king against his flesh and blood. "The wicked boy wishes to possess your kingdom, and he plans when you are killed to extend it as far as Italy, forsooth, that he may possess the kingdom which his grandfather Theodoric held in Italy." Per Gregory of Tours, Sigismund was aroused by these words, and taking the advice of his wicked wife, he became a wicked parricide. For when his son had been made drowsy by wine, he bade him sleep in the afternoon, and while he slept a napkin was placed under his neck and tied under his chin, and he was strangled by two servants who drew in opposite directions. Almost immediately, Sigismund regretted the deed, collapsing in tears upon the body of his dearly departed boy. "Henceforth, wail for yourself," came an old and knowing voice, "that you have become a most cruel parricide through base counsel, for there is no need to wail for this innocent boy who has been strangled." Who was it that dared speak to the king so boldly? Was it a monk or a soothsayer, a voice from above or one from below? Gregory of Tours never says, recounting instead how the sorry King Sigismund took solace in the mountain retreat of St. Maurice. There at his newly founded monastery, Sigismund wept and fasted for many days, his one small comfort, the perpetual service of song that continues to this day. God, it seems, forgave Sigismund, for in those early days of his church, he had to be more merciful. After returning to Lugdunum, the king was granted 5 more years of peace. He did not know it then, but in death this wicked parricide became a Catholic saint, an elevation that must have made a corpse in Tours spin inside its grave. Among the realm of the living, meanwhile, the king of the Ostrogoths and queen of the Franks were hell-bent on revenge, Theodoric on behalf of his grandson, and Clotilda on behalf of her parents. Though you may recall it was Gundobad who had made Clotilda an orphan, to her the sins of this father were also the sins of the son. While Theodoric prepared his invasion, Clotilda spurred her sons to action. With the death of Clovis in 511, it was these 3 sons, along with their half-brother, who jointly ruled the kingdom of the Franks. "Let me not repent," Clotilda told them, "that I have nursed you lovingly. Be angry, I beg you, at the insult to me, and avenge with a wise zeal the death of my father and mother." And so it was, for the first but not the last time, that France claimed the Burgundian inheritance. With the Franks on one side and the Ostrogoths on the other, Sigismund hardly stood a chance. In 523, the Burgundian army commanded by Sigismund and his brother Godemar was completely destroyed. Though the king again retreated to his monastery, this time he only made it as far as the gates. He and his family were captured by Clotilda's son Clodomir, then dragged from the monastery of St. Maurice to the Frankish city of Orléans. For now, they were Clodomir's captives, but when Sigismund's brother Godomar decided to continue the fight, this Frankish warlord suddenly started having second thoughts. He wondered openly whether he was making a mistake leaving enemies at home and marching against the rest. Would it not be easier to kill Sigismund and be done with it, and for good measure, to kill his family too?
If, came the reply, you would look to God and amend your counsel, God will be with you, and you shall go and win the victory. But if you kill them, you shall be surrendered yourself into the hands of your enemies, and shall perish in the same way. And what you do to Sigismund and his wife and children shall be done to you and your wife and sons.
This time we know who gave the reply. It came from the abbot Aetius, the third saint in our story. Like Gregory of Tours, Aetius descended from an old Gallo-Roman family of senatorial origins, in his case, one that even managed to produce an emperor, his very namesake. As secretary to the Burgundian kings, it was Aetius who had converted Sigismund to the Nicene Creed. But though he may have managed to save his king's soul, he did not manage to save his life. Clodomir had Sigismund, along with his wife and children, beheaded, their bodies unceremoniously dropped into a well. He had brought his mother's Faihitha to its all-too grisly conclusion, but by killing Sigismund's children, he had gone further than Gundobad, crossing a Rubicon that Aetius had starkly warned him against. In the end, Clodomir would not live long enough to ever regret having done so. After launching a second expedition into Burgundy, Clodomir and Godomar met at Vézérance. But after the last king of Burgundy took flight, the doomed son of Clotilda was lured into a trap. While pursuing Godomar's forces, Clodomir became separated from the rest of the Franks, a mistake the Burgundians seized upon by imitating their adversaries' war cry. Believing them to be Franks, the trap was sprung, Clodomir killed, his head put on a pike, and paraded around in victory. Yet another spoke in the blood-greased wheel of Faihitha. After that, it would take 10 long years for Burgundy to finally fall, most of its territory swallowed up by the ravenous kingdom of the Franks. Of Godomar, it was said he lived incognito in the lands he formerly ruled. Of his late brother Sigismund, that his saintly remains were recovered and centuries later transferred to the distant lands of Bohemia. As for the doomed family of Clodomir, it was their misfortune to suffer almost exactly the fate divined by Aetius. His children were entrusted to their grandmother Clotilda, and because the Merovingians happily ate their own, 2 of the 3 were murdered by their uncles Clotaire and Childebert. The third shaved his locks, retired to a monastery, and in death became St. Cloud, the 4th saint in our story. His mother had a less happy fate, forced to share the bed of Clodomir, her children's murderous uncle. Eventually, Clodomir outlived his wife, his brothers, and everyone else who stood in his path, uniting the whole of the Franks and Burgundians for the first time in history. When he died, the kingdom was divided, the wheel of Faihitha reset, and the whole process begun anew, till the Merovingians went the way of the Nibelungs. Never again would the Burgundians be without a suzerain. From this point on, they were always caught between the Franks of the West and those of the East, between the kingdom of the French and the kingdom of the Germans. After the 10th century, the short-lived kingdom of Arles Burgundy came into existence as a royal possession of the Holy Roman Empire. West of the River Saône, there was a second Burgundy, a ducal possession of the Kingdom of France. It was there, in a land where blood flowed as freely as wine, that the Burgundians would again enjoy their moment under the sun. Much would change before then, but as surely as the Mauriac comet returned, the Burgundians continued to dream of restoring the kingdom of Gunther. Thanks for watching the first chapter in this multi-part Burgundian series. Get early, exclusive, and ad-free content by signing up on Patreon, like these wonderful empire builders on screen. Also, don't forget to check out Forge of Empires and sign up with this QR code or the link down below.